You're listening to the We Are Libertarians podcast network. Find all of our shows at wearelibertarians.com.
Switch to Verizon Business and get more from your internet without paying more for your internet. Get LTE Business Internet starting at $39 a month when paired with a Business Unlimited smartphone plan. That's unlimited data, and with it, unlimited possibilities. Start saving today with Verizon Business, ranked #1 in small business internet customer satisfaction by J.D. Power. Starting price for 25 megabits per second internet plan with savings, plus taxes, fees, and economic adjustment charge. Terms apply. For J.D. Power 2024 award information, visit jdpower.com/awards.
You know what's smart? Enjoying a fresh gourmet meal at home that you didn't have to cook. Meet Factor, your loophole in the laws of mealtime. Chef-crafted meals delivered with a tap, ready in just 2 minutes. You know what's even smarter? Treating yourself without cheating your goals. Factor is dietitian approved, chef prepared, and you plated. Pretty smart, huh? Refresh your routine and eat smart with Factor. Learn more at factormeals.com.
Welcome to the Chris Spangle Show. Thanks so much for joining me here on the program today. It is great to be with you, and I have a guest, a good friend, Leslie Corbly. She's been on the program several times, and she's going to start coming on the program more. We had, after your last interview, Leslie, gosh, we talked for an hour afterwards, didn't we?
Something like that. It was good. It was a great conversation.
Yeah, and I think the core of it is you and I are in similar places, both libertarian, very unenthused. Now, I'm speaking for me, but let me see if you identify with this, okay? I'm not going to speak for you, but libertarian-ish, right? Not that enthused about the current libertarian movement, and maybe a little more leaning into Christianity and what that means and how that plays out in political life and worldviews and what all that means. And you and I had this great conversation. I was like, you know what? We should just be recording this stuff. Let's start having more of these conversations. Did I fairly represent you or shade how you feel right now about politics?
Yes. Yes, yeah, more or less where I'm at. Just wanting to look at issues from maybe a bit of a broader standpoint. I think sometimes in the libertarian sphere, it can feel almost like a forced consensus, and so wanting to look at issues from a broader worldview perspective is where I've been at the past few years.
Yeah, I mean, I got into libertarianism in 2007 because it was foreign policy that led to peace and economic policy that led to prosperity and social policy that led to harmony. And now it really feels like I've got to believe a conspiracy a week about aiming hurricanes at Trump's palace. So I don't know. And as I really grow deeper in my faith and start looking at these things, I'm like, I'm asking myself bigger questions. And this is, I think, it's already creeping into the show, and one of them is about worldview. And I feel like we should probably start by defining what a worldview is, because secular culture is sort of the air that we breathe. It's like if you're a fish, you don't know what water is. Water is just water, right? But for Christians, you end up having a different viewpoint. And I promise, we're not going to preach to you. We are going to articulate why a lot of people on the right seem a little weird and believe different things. And, hopefully you'll learn a little something if you maybe don't agree. But what's a worldview, and maybe a Christian worldview, and how that differs from a secular humanist worldview?
So the way I think of a worldview, one of the most helpful ways it was explained to me was it's essentially like a pair of glasses you wear when you see the world, right? As soon as you become sort of it's how you view the world. It's how you view your place in it. It's how you view morality, issues of justice. So it's sort of the lens that taints how you perceive all incoming facts and information that you analyze when you determine what you believe is right or wrong, and kind of the reasons why and why not. So in that sense, everyone has a worldview, even if they can't articulate it, right? Because even if it's just an experience, everyone moves through the world and has various experiences that lead them to think, more about, that lead them to think differently about issues of morality and justice. So I think of it as like the lens that you view the world through.
Yeah, it's like a set of principles. I mean, for Christians, they use it through the Bible, but like a libertarian analysis of politics all flows through, let's say, the non-aggression principle, right? So you're judging how you view a specific issue based on a certain principle. Should the government use force on this? Well, murder, yes, put that person in jail. Rape, yes, put this person in jail. I take it one step further. Why are those things bad? The Judeo-Christian worldview is that all humans are created in the image of God. It's the concept of the Imago Dei. So therefore, if you kill an animal, that is criminal because we as a society have said that's criminal, but that's not necessarily destroying an image bearer, right? There's an extra harsher penalty for a human being versus an animal. And that comes directly from the West, the Christian worldview lens. I don't know if I want to say the West, because Christianity isn't just a Western religion. I feel like we're getting that a little wrong. So that Imago Dei is one piece of a worldview that many of us have adopted. Left, right? I mean, all of us sort of have these things, Leslie, that we feel are wrong, and it's just sort of been ingrained in our society because of these principles.
And that's why it's interesting. I think I've always thought man on the street interviews were really interesting because they're really funny what people will end up saying. And B, I think that they really do reveal how everyone has a worldview, right? You'll see people kind of stutter or maybe think through what they're saying kind of in real time. And I think that shows how people may or may not know how to articulate well the underlying principle that they hold to, and yet it's still there. Right. And every time anyone thinks through any issue of any significance in their life, whether it's political or otherwise, philosophical or otherwise, they're thinking through what it is that they believe and why. And that's sort of the foundation of a worldview.
Would you say it's like a gut instinct in some people?
Yeah, I think it is. And I think that that's good and bad, right? Mm-hmm. On the one hand, yes, I want everyone to think through their worldview and have well-formed reasons for why they believe in different principles. But on the other hand, that can become a trap in the sense of you don't want to negate your conscience, right? If you just think through your principles in a almost robotic fashion, I think that leaves you open to different types of errors that you wouldn't be prone to if you were to say, wow, I have a gut instinct that that's wrong.
Yeah.
And maybe I can't articulate why, but that feels really wrong, and I'm not going to do it, or I'm not going to agree with whatever that is. So I think that there's value in both, ways of thinking.
Yeah, it sort of feels like in the middle of a campaign season, people pay attention a lot more. And so you being a political writer and me being a political podcaster, I don't know about you, but I get a lot of like high school friends kind of messaging me going, hey, what's this thing? Or do you have a quiz like isidewith.com that can tell me what I believe? Or I sort of feel like I identify with this party, but I don't really know. Like, I feel like this is a great time for people to start asking them questions. Like, at what point did you start asking questions? I mean, for me, it's like constant. I'm constantly trying to having kids does that, right? All of a sudden you have to teach your principles and values to another person. You are a new mom. Congratulations on the birth of your baby boy. Like, literally like a month ago, right?
Yes, he is. Well, he's 6 weeks old. He just had a 6-week checkup. So
I know I was like, man, I'm going to give her some space. And then I saw you do an interview like the week after he was born. I was like, all right, well, maybe we ought to get you back on the podcast.
Yeah, well, and that's the benefit, I guess, of like, being home a lot. Like, I don't know. It's good in my opinion, it was at least healthy for me to have, something I could kind of go back to and keep doing after. That didn't require me to like get in my car and, do a whole, you know what I mean? Like, yeah. It wasn't a whole rigmarole to get things ready to go. So, yeah.
So I don't know if it's already hit you that you're eventually going to have to teach this young creature principles and values and how to interact in society. Like, has it hit you yet?
That hit me like while I was pregnant. I was like, this is wild. And I also joke because I have a bad habit of like cursing too much in my private life. Not that anyone needed to know that, but now you do. And I was like, you're gonna have like a 1-year-old and you can't, like, this is not gonna work anymore.
It is crazy how much I don't cuss anymore.
It's insane. Yeah. I'm like, oh my goodness, you can't. That works when you're just married. It doesn't work when there's a 2-year-old running around. What? Repeating everything you say.
Our 5-year-old, she asked why the F word was a bad thing. And I just looked at her and I said, I don't know. it's a social. I tried to explain to this little 5-year-old what a social construct of society was, and how we all just have agreed to participate in this thing that, for some reason, the F word's a bad thing, and you're a bad person if you say it. But I don't really think that, so it's an adult word, and we just eventually got down to like, you'll get in trouble at school, so just don't say it.
I know. How are you going to go through the whole, like analysis, for example, of what the difference in interpretation of the F word, like centuries ago, would have been versus now?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, like, how do you get into that with a 5-year-old?
Because you can't. You don't want to explain
it's not
sex
used in the same way.
Yeah, you like basically it's a mean word that makes people feel bad, so don't use it. She's like, oh, okay. She doesn't like to make people feel bad, but she's asking big questions. Like we were watching Harry Potter the other night, and I'm sure a lot of people are like, you show a 5-year-old Harry Potter, but she's very advanced, and there's a part of where Voldemort is whispering in Harry's ear, you can't do it, you're gonna lose, it's all hopeless. And she's like, that sounds like Satan. Is he Satan? So then we started having conversations about how media creates constructs of like it just you will love having your kid get older, because all of a sudden, Leslie, you're gonna have little conversations with a 5-year-old that are so deep, and it starts like around 2 or 3, and it pushes you. It has pushed me to really start thinking deeply about more things, and instead of just doing this podcast around my gut of climate change sounds fake, I don't like it because I grew up in a right-wing media environment. Well, is that true? Obviously, with the hurricanes, I'm like, let me think about that. Or, I don't know. Thinking more deeply about these things, and parenting, I think, is just a huge, huge piece of that. So, is there anything that like you're thinking about where you're like, man, I've always believed this thing. This might be on shaky ground.
Ooh,
and I know it's early, but
yeah, that's a tough one. I would have to think about it for a minute, because I'm sure there's something there. But I'm sure there's something there.
Yeah, so
it's a little shakier. I mean, I've definitely had a transformation. I want to say in the past few years of, I feel like pre and post COVID is big for most people. It certainly was for me, as far as how I started to perceive the place of politics in my life, at least, and the distinctions between the political and the social and cultural, and how sometimes, like, again, it's good to separate those, but on the one hand, culture drives law, and law also drives culture.
Right.
I think the libertarian spaces in particular are really weak on culture. And that definitely pushed me in a certain direction as far as what it was I wanted to do with my life. But yeah, I think that there's a overemphasis a lot of times on the political and the here and now, and not a lot of emphasis on how you build the foundations for whatever policies it is you're pushing forward to actually produce a better world.
Yeah, it sort of feels like in the libertarian world, it's the end goal, and it's like step 32. And then, okay, well, what's step 1 through 30? You're like, I mean, whatever you want, man. Okay, well, and that's I think why I lean into civil society a lot, because you in a pluralistic society, whether you like pluralism and liberalism or not, that's what the hand you've been dealt. But people have the freedom to voluntarily choose to act on the common good in these certain areas that move them. It's like the free market of culture, right? So that, I think, I had the same reaction as you. It just sort of led me down that road, like where that's like the short version of that same conversation in my head. Where have you kind of been leading? Like, okay, going right to policy isn't working. That's not persuasive. That's not where we ought to go. Like, what are steps 1 through 30 that you've thought about?
Man, from a practical standpoint, that's tough, because I think that we don't really have any shared cultural meaning anymore. You need to do a lot more cultural work if the more pluralistic a society becomes, right? Because then you have less of shared cultural meaning, and that shared cultural meaning is what actually drives real consensus. And what started to really frustrate me in the libertarian space was when you say you have consensus, but you don't really. I don't know if you've ever gotten that sense, right?
Yeah.
That you're trying to build a consensus, but because there's so many underlying like premise level disputes that individuals or factions have, then you never are able to really have a genuine solid consensus. And I think that leads to very shaky foundations.
There's no solidarity. And so like these are very Christian like ideas and heady ideological terms. So like pluralism is when people decide to work together for the common good, and you have different cultures and groups and everybody's kind of working together, and solidarity is that agreement basically to work together towards, what did you say, the common cause, or like the glue for America for a long time is like our founding. But once we all start questioning the founding, or in libertarian speak, it's like, I'm not laying this at Austin Peterson's feet, but once Austin Peterson said, I'm a libertarian that doesn't believe in the non-aggression principle, and then a bunch of people went with him, that unglues the solidarity, right? So you have to have those common core glues, and I think in a lot of ways, I don't know how you feel about this, but coming from like the pat down and having access to a large black audience, they're like, look, the common glue has been white evangelical culture for a long time.
Yeah.
And now that we're saying this isn't just the monoculture of this, let everybody have access to the public square, that I think makes a lot of the racist right wing mad. And it also is, it unglues some of that consensus. So I think race has kind of played some of that. Religion has kind of played at some of the unmooring of the pluralism over the last 30 years. Economics and growing income inequality. All these things seem to be tearing at that consensus that you're talking about.
Yeah, I think that one of the foundational ways I think about it is, imagine if you and your wife had different definitions of words like respect and dignity, and then you're trying to raise children. Like, how well is that going to go? Right, that's going to be a mess.
Yeah,
because you don't have an act. You're saying you both care about the same things, but in reality you don't, because you define them totally differently.
Yeah.
I think that that's sort of where we're at in culture right now, right? People say, well, what about just basic dignity and respect, or various iterations of that type of phrase? But in reality, people have very different priors that they're bringing to those conversations that are difficult for others to know about, right? Again, we're increasingly, I think, in a situation where what people believe and why is not something that they're necessarily easily able to articulate. And so it's more projected into these partisan political games, because that offers like an easy sort of totalizing worldview that makes it easier to move through society.
Do you have any advice for people listening who are like, this all sounds right, how do I start learning about what I believe? How do I start that process of figuring that out? What did that look like for you?
Gosh, I guess how old were you when you got interested in these issues? I was really young.
Me too.
Really young.
I hardcore secular worldview, atheist in high school, became a Christian. But really, like, I've always been a news junkie. I've always been into, I guess, like what I have always liked, Leslie, is the weather, not the climate. Right. So I like the weather of politics, of who's up, who's down, what's Trump doing, is Kamala weak, is she gaining in the polls? Like, I always was attracted to that piece until the last few years, which has made this show difficult, because I'm trying to think through what I believe now in terms of the climate, right? The climate determines the weather. It's those beliefs above. And so I think I always have had a lot of interest in philosophy and politics and history and, ideology, but I never really understood those currents. And so for me, it was starting the history of modern politics. I'll tell you actually what the beginning of it was. Longtime listeners may remember this. It was when Roger Paxton and I got in a fight on a podcast. And he said, you are a libertarian, but you don't know anything about libertarianism. You don't understand what you believe. I've never met anybody who's read less libertarian philosophy than you, sort of to paraphrase. And he wasn't wrong. which is why it made me really mad at the time. But it was like, well, I'm going to show you. get a book out and start reading. And I was like, man, I really don't understand the ideological gift of libertarianism, which led me to like start tracing back the ideology of it, which led me to going, all right, what's the roots of progressivism and conservatism, which led back to like ancient Greece and Christian thing. And so it's just sort of been this like 5 to 6 year journey through a lot of like thinkers. Now, I think that's probably a little headier than than a lot of people because I had a head start on stuff, but I don't know. There's a lot of great books who just sort of, when we started the History of Modern Politics podcast, which was meant for Matt and I to just sort of like go, all right, so what was the last generation thinking about in terms of politics, and how did that inform our generation of political conversation? We started, and let's go back to Clinton. Once we dug into that, we were like, oh, well, we have to go back to Nixon and his era. Oh, we got to go back to Eisenhower. Oh, we got to go back to FDR. Oh, we got to go back to Wilson. Oh, we got to... Then finally, by like ancient Rome, we were like, we've got to just stop here and just do Rome and focus on one stream, the Anglo stream of, you know. So I think history for me was how I really started to dig into these things, because the story helped me start to figure out, okay, here's what I think, here's the history of these things, here's the history of like Ukraine, here's the history of the conflict, and that kind of gave me a little bit more of a glimpse into, okay, I think I believe this. Right? Like NATO, I think I'm a lot more on board with NATO now than I was 10 years ago, where I was just like, well, Ron Paul told me not to like NATO, so I don't like it. Right? So, and then that's just simply from reading history and understanding agreements and thinking through human behavior. And so that's how I've done it. I don't know about you. Hopefully that answers your question. There was more than enough there probably too.
No, I think it does. That's interesting. So I guess I can't tell other people what exactly will work for them, but I got really interested in these issues. I was really young. I was like, I think I put myself on a deadline to have adopted a worldview by the time I was 18. And
you were homeschooled, weren't you?
I was, and I told myself I was going to do this when I was 12, and I had it's like this bizarrely sophisticated reason for it, which was that when you're homeschooled, especially back in the 2000s, it was a much more stigmatized decision. Now I look out and I'm like, man, homeschoolers are like normal members of society. Back then it was a very
My wife is homeschooled, and that's why I asked that question. Not only because we talked about this before the show, but like the way that I hear my wife talk about these things is very much like that, like very earnest about the world at a very young age.
Yeah, well, that was because it was really back then a very nonconformist thing to do. So that's one of the things I think is interesting when people talk about homeschoolers, and when more progressive spaces, again, colloquially speaking, secularly progressive spaces. Think if you were at a university setting or anywhere where you're going to walk into the room and you kind of assume people there are going to be more on the left side of the aisle,
right?
Is when they talk about things like when they talk about nonconformity, they sort of assume that nonconformity is only in relation to either to a more Christian, traditional, or conservative worldview.
Right.
And they don't really have much of a conception of what nonconformity juxtaposed against a secular, progressive worldview looks like. Mm-hmm. Because in their mind, that's nonconformity, right? They don't have they have a very binary, it seems like, viewpoint of what nonconformity looks like. And so anyway, that's what was always interesting to me. But one of the things that I knew when I was about 12, one of the reasons I wanted to adopt a worldview by the time I was 18 was because I knew I was going right from this very traditional conservative kind of Christian. I say that because it was complicated growing up what my parents' viewpoints were on certain issues, but I knew I was going straight from that culture right to a progressive culture. And so because there's only so much time and resources in the day, I always thought of the idea of, I looked at all the evidence to choose my worldview, right? I chose what I believed based on the totality of the evidence. I always saw that as sort of an illusion. Like,
Right.
how can you possibly do that, right? I mean, if you grew up in the Middle East, for example, you're much more likely to have a heavy exposure to the Islamic worldview. And you might not have exposure to some other worldview that you wouldn't even, how would you even know about
Right.
those
And
beliefs,
how
right?
can
So-
one person, especially like 13, understand the totality of evidence in the world? Like it.
Well, no one can do that at
Yeah,
all, right?
right.
Like, you can't even process every philosophic option available to you, right? At the end of the day, you have to accept the limitations of time and history, i.e., you were born into a specific family and you have only a set amount of time to make these decisions. So my concern, it's interesting, my concern with waiting too long to adopt a worldview. So I thought, well, you could just figure it out in college. And I thought, well, if you do that, then you'll run into the trap of acting something out and then wanting to justify it and sort of adopting a worldview without your own consent. It's like you sort of undermine your own ability to consent by doing that. So what I told myself was, okay, you'll adopt a worldview, whatever that is, by age 18, and then you'll act it out to the best of your ability
And
for 10 years.
For 10 years. So, and by that, did you mean like I'm going to write down a list of rules or philosophical principles, or like what did that mean to your young brain?
Well, especially given my situation. So it was just homeschooling back in the day, or at least in my context. Every homeschooler is different. I'm very aware of this, but was very isolating. And so there was not a lot of opportunity for, at least, well, there was some opportunity for social engagement, but it was primarily with people that might, because I have 6 older siblings. So they would be bringing people into the home, or it was things of that nature. It wasn't, what you would
When
think
you
of
walk-
as normal peer interactions.
Dude, your little sister just asked me what my worldview is. She's weird. Is it like that?
It was that weirdo, honestly. I can think of the questions. I'm not joking. The questions I asked the now spouses of my siblings, I'm like, what were you doing? This is wild. I've been thinking about fill in the blank bizarre niche topics. So what are your thoughts on that? Do tell.
That's so funny.
Hey, they still married into the family anyway, so it all worked out.
You were not a barrier to entry. Good.
No, I did not block anyone from getting married, thankfully. But so what I planned on doing was, okay, in my head, I was thinking, well, that means you have an because of the way this is set up, you have time to think through what you believe, but how to live that out might be a little bit more tricky. So I didn't want to have too fleshed out of a set of rules, because then you're not really acting on your own volition, right? So it's hard to tell whether you're just doing something out of the motivation of conformity, which for me was like kind of a dirty word in my head.
So to kind of illustrate the worldview, just to pick at this a little more, like what were some of the choices? Just so for people who don't really think about this, like they're not reading Francis Schaeffer like you and I are. So like, were you choosing like, I'm going to be an Islamist, or I'm going to be Buddhist, or I'm going to be a pink-haired Starbucks barista?
I was kind of radically honest that I was in, and I'm not saying it was entirely binary in my head, but because of my personal experience, I thought it was better to limit, at least for the decade, my first decade of adulthood, the universe of worldview options to roughly secular thought versus Christian thought.
Right.
Because those were the two that I had some degree of familiarity with. And the time and resources that would have been required to try to include, let's say, 2 to 5 other viewpoints would have made the process more like onerous to a degree that it would have no longer been as likely to result in choosing a worldview that I really believed was true.
So
Does that make sense?
Yeah,
You just would have
absolutely,
had the time
totally.
to go
I mean,
through it.
it's already a lot of work. Like you're a teenager picking out, and I think that's some of the weight that teens bear now is they have to figure out what they believe in a moral code, and it's very difficult. So it's interesting to hear you doing that work.
I also thought, well, in this way, you'll be answering the base level questions about worldview, right? Like one of the most important questions you're going to ask is, do you believe in God?
Right.
For example, right? And so if you decide you believe in God, you've now limited your, like, even if you, let's say hypothetically, I ended up 10 years later thinking Christianity was the wrong religion, well, you've still answered that foundational question as to whether you believe there's a higher power.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah,
So
no,
you
I mean,
sort
once
of
you believe in God,
that's
then you are limiting yourself to, if you truly actually believe there's a God, eventually you get to a choice. Am I going
Yes.
to engage in a relationship with this God and discover their personality and then adopt their likeness in me?
Mhm.
Or am I going to live like that God doesn't exist? Therefore, I'm really an agnostic, right? So that, I think, is an important choice. And I think secularism versus a Christian worldview, maybe we ought to kind of pick that apart. You know, as you were going through this, what did secular mean to you, and what does it mean to you now versus like a Christian worldview?
That was one of the things I struggled with. So secular to me, I mean, at first I thought, okay, there's an absence of a belief in God. But the more I sort of looked at what would that look like if I were to live it out? What does it mean for there to be no God? The more I sort of struggled with that seemed to be an illusory concept. So because the idea of God, I'm not saying anything about necessarily whether that God's supernatural, for example, or whether that God's personal characteristics, if any, are, but I mean just the technical idea of God seemed necessary in order to live, right? Like God being the top of your hierarchy, for example. I think that's one of the ways Jordan Peterson has described it.
Right.
But yeah, I really bumped into that problem where I'm going, okay, if you're living in the world, hypothetically, you're making all these decisions as an adult. The way you're rank ordering those decisions is going to assume something's at the highest.
Yeah.
Right. Like there's some value or whatever that's above all of them that you use to orient your choices. And so if that's the case and it ends up being you, have you just said you're God, for example? And if it's
Right.
someone else, why? So I started to really wrestle with the concept of why atheists and those who are more secular, obviously this is not all of them, but there seems to be this thread of almost anger against a fictitious entity. And I found that really odd because why would you be angry at something you don't believe exists?
That was me. That was me to a T,
You know.
until I was 18, because I remember being drugged in 96 to the Billy Graham crusade and just thinking these were the dumbest, weakest people. But now I look back and there was a stirring in my heart at that event, but there was also a tremendous anger, right? And I'd be drugged to church at the Methodist church on Sundays, and I would feel stirring in my heart. And it's from a Christian perspective, that is God calling me to him. But there was this resistance, this anger at him. And so I clearly believed in God, but I would have said I was an atheist and still say I was an atheist because I didn't mentally believe there was a God, but there was something in me that was drawn to the idea of God, the idea of Jesus. Like there was something in me that was clearly, rebellion's the only word for it. I really kind of knew, but I wanted to hate it.
That's interesting because I actually had in some ways the reverse experience where I was drawn to a sort of atheistic worldview, but I really struggled to define how that would look in practice outside of anarchy. I thought anarchy made a lot of sense as a like political like manifestation of atheism, but I didn't like it seemed like a lot of cherry picking from atheists on the moral front of we still want to have morality. We want to root it in something that's not God, so rooting it in man. But that seemed odd to me in the sense of if you're rooting your morality in man, right? And God is in fact, like if you're right that God is in fact not real, then the concept of God is just derivative of man.
Yeah.
So if religion is this terrible thing that you're saying is harms society so much, what you're really saying harms society is man because God isn't real. And so it seemed a little odd to me, this concept of, oh, if we get rid of religion, we'll have made the world a better place. It's like, well, have you really gotten rid of religion? Or because if God is in fact not real, isn't religion just another form of philosophy?
Right.
Right. I mean, what makes it different?
And you've kind of hit upon what secular humanism believes. I mean, just to kind of give it a short history lesson, right? You live in what's called the Dark Ages, which is called the Dark Ages because the Enlightenment historians called it the Dark Ages, when everybody was backward and didn't believe in science and all the salvific effects of, of the Enlightenment effects, right? And then in the Enlightenment, we start to go, well, maybe we can remake the world in the image of God, and maybe man is really just an animal. There isn't a God, and we define our morals based on what the human consensus is, not some divine book or divine revelation. We're really just advancing society towards the French Revolution, where we're just going to kill each other over stupid stuff, right? So, and so you really get in the Enlightenment, like it sets the stage, and there's a great book by Andrew Wilson called, it's about 1776. Let me look up the title, because he does such a great job of kind of explaining all of the history. In 1776 is like the peak of Enlightenment. And I'm padding while I talk, but and how that remaking the world, how 1776 created the post-Christian West. And I interviewed him back last December, if you want to hear more about this. But this was a great book, Leslie, that really got me thinking about Enlightenment philosophy and how that shaped the rest of our understanding of the world post 1776 versus more of the, like, I'd classify that as the secular humanist view of we're all just animals and we are all just sacks of meat trying to figure it out and come to a consensus, versus there is divine order, there is a structure because there is a creator, and so therefore there is actual truth.
Exactly. And so those things started to really, it was difficult for me to rationalize that in my mind of why would we reject, why morality really mattered? Like, why did I care about all of these issues to begin with? Because at the end of the day, it's just if you're just a sort of a game, so to speak, right? Why does this matter?
It's all chance.
Like, what's the point of me caring about all these issues? And I started to struggle to define, morally speaking, from an atheistic standpoint, why sociopathology was wrong. And I know that sounds like kind of crazy, but when you think about it, you go, okay, well, why is it wrong to kill someone? And I don't mean for any reason. So that was another fascinating thing to me, is when I thought about the justifications for issues like abortion, and taking maybe a more liberal stance on death with dignity, things of that nature. I thought it was really interesting that the atheistic arguments tended to focus on justifying the death of those who were socially vulnerable. Whereas I found it really odd that I didn't see a lot of atheistic, hey, let's rethink, for example, the morality of whether or not someone who's in an abusive, let's say a child's being abused by their parent, is it wrong for the child to end the abuse by taking out the parent? Right. Or, you can take child and parent and insert any abusive dynamic there. And it kind of, to me, I thought, well, that's interesting that there seems to be a lot of arguments for rethinking certain elements of Christian morality, but not others. So there's reasons for that. You can sort of see threads of underlying motivations in the logical arguments that are being made. So again, that spoke to this idea of logic being very useful in determining what you believe, but that it's sort of not the only way you can arrive at truth, nor is it void of the emotive, right? There's motivations behind why you're exploring certain logical, like, arguments that answer the questions you're asking, if that makes sense. You're not in some void where you're automatically exploring the most rational argument that answers your question. There's all kinds of different iterations of those, and your starting point matters a lot. And that starting point is often a motivation, right? And that comes from something that's more emotive.
Yeah, and what your parents taught you and some of those things. So let's just take a pause here, and the next time we get together, we're going to talk about the Republican Party and its change under Trump, because I think he's someone fundamentally, I don't know, maybe he has a worldview, maybe he doesn't. We'll talk about that in the next episode, but we're going to talk about the Republican platform that was passed at the convention and the change from 2016 and what the Republican Party was when we were kids and what it is now and where it's going. But before we go, let's do some book recommendations. So I've got a couple recommendations on this. I'll throw mine here up on the screen because I have the power. And as I would say Francis Schaeffer's A Christian Manifesto is a short book, and it talks a lot about some of this stuff. You've read it. You read it in conjunction with the Communist Manifesto. So, like the good student you are. I read it last month, and very, very enlightening. And there's also this little book called What's Your Worldview by James Anderson. This is a really, really short book. And what it is it's like a little choose your own adventure of worldview, and it outlines all these different worldviews, and it asks you some questions, some foundational questions about what you believe, and then it kind of help guides you to the worldview that best fits you and makes you think about some of these big questions. It's like 100 pages too, so and $8 over on Amazon. So I'll put those in the show notes. Are there any books that were influential or maybe kind of could help people think about this stuff on a deeper path that you might recommend?
Sure, man. I'm trying to think of one that's recent and one that's not. I definitely, anything by Charles Colson. I really enjoyed reading his work when I was in high school. I want to say my favorite was probably his biography, oddly enough, just because I thought it was a really good. So it's Born Again.
Born Again, yeah. His experience of becoming a Christian after his involvement in the Nixon. In Watergate. Yeah, he was Nixon's hatchet man. Long story short, if you don't know Colson, he was Nixon's hatchet man, goes to prison in Watergate and becomes a Christian, starts a ministry, the Colson Center. And then I'm working through his How Now Then Shall We Live, which is really good. So it's a really good book. And then one that's more recent, I think I really enjoyed work by Carl Trueman and his discussion of expressive individualism. I know he has, I think it was the rise and triumph of the modern self. Yes. And he has a shorter version of that though, that's quite a bit Strange faster. New World? Yes. Strange New World. Yes. Yeah, that one. And I read that last year. Fantastic book. Really does. I thought it did a really good job of explaining how the rise of expressive individualism and the impact of that idea on our current culture, and how probably most individuals pick up a lot of the way of their worldview from osmosis and sort of sitting in the ideas that came out of, really the Enlightenment, I think is what he brings it back to. But it's a really good historical survey of that. I will put these in the show notes if you want to check them out. Now, we have listed Francis Schaeffer and Charles Colson, which is making the progressives horrified, because that sounds like the Christian conservative right. That's like Jerry Falwell stuff, right? So we'll talk about how some of these authors and their ideas shaped the Republican Party until Donald Trump, and where that's going in our next episode. Leslie, thanks so much for being here. It's been such a fun conversation, like always. Thanks so much for having me on. I'm happy to come back again soon. All right. Thanks, and we'll see you again here soon on the Chris Spangle.